Thank you, Michael. That's very kind. I'm proud of all that, but I'll tell you what I'm really proud of. I'm proud to be the dad of a couple of Armenian kids who speak Armenian better than I do. Nothing makes me happier. I'm proud to be a Sunday school teacher at Holy Cross, just north of here a little bit in Bethesda, where I teach young kids about their Christian faith, which we hold in communion with the Coptic community as brothers and sisters in the Eastern Oriental Orthodox family. So we are as tight as they come. If God forbid, if I die not near an Armenian church, I can receive the sacraments in a Coptic church. That's how very close we are. We're brothers and sisters. So that's my story. My story is I'm an Armenian here in DC, work for an Armenian organization, and I'm very devoted to my faith and the survival of the Armenian people. That's my story. Not super interesting. Let me tell you the story of Armenians in America. I will try to do it relatively quickly, give you a sense of what it's been like to be Armenian in America, especially in the political sense. We've been in this country now since the 1880s or 1890s, in large numbers since the 19-teens, around the time of the Armenian genocide. And over this period of like 120, 130 years, 140 years now, we've sort of evolved in a lot of different ways. The arc of it, if I had to summarize it, is something like going from being the object acted upon to being the subject acting upon. I'm not sure I got the grammar exactly right. It was never great at sort of diagramming sentences in my English classes. But that's the general arc is something like, how can we be the authors of our destiny and not simply the victims of others, right? Which has sadly been the history of the Armenians for a great long time. So we started out in America as early immigrants who came in the 1880s, 1890s, up until the teens, right? As an immigrant community, very early immigrants, largely came for factory work in the industrial Northeast and the Midwest. Some folks went out to Central California, like Fresno, and worked in the fields, right? But it was a very, very early immigrant community without great language skills, without great education, without a lot of social connections, and all the other things, the markers of power in America. But at the same time as this community is getting its feet under it, terrible things are happening back home, right? By 1909, later 1915, there's just massacres and vast deportations and mass murder of Armenians. So the community then has to decide, like, what are we going to do about this? Some went back and fought, right? Others organized in America. And the principle that they organized around, it was, for lack of a better word, I'm going to say pity or compassion or solidarity or whatever it was. Here was a Christian nation on the verge of extinction, right? So the Armenian leaders of the day, right, including from our organization, sought to spark the conscience of the American people and say, look, this terrible thing is happening. Let us help save these Christians. Let us help save these Armenians. President Wilson was very sympathetic. The Congress chartered an organization called Near East Relief, which is active all over the world until this day, that raised in modern dollars billions of dollars to help Armenians. My grandmother was raised in an orphanage funded by the United States, and for which I'm eternally grateful. So we got lots of medicine, lots of tents, lots of orphanages, lots of relief. Orphans were adopted into families, and there was a great effort to keep the Armenians from dying, which we welcomed, right? But we also learned the limits of pity, compassion, whatever, solidarity, which is that when the war ended, World War I ended, and the Turks got themselves organized under Kemal Ataturk, and the Russians got themselves organized under the new Bolshevik government. And when they decided to march on Armenia, all the sympathy, all the soft power in the world didn't amount to anything, and Armenia was partitioned. So that's a first learning experience for us, which was, is it nice when people feel sorry for you? Yes. Would you turn it away? Never. Don't have the right to turn away a shipment of medicine or whatever it is for people in need. But we saw the very hard limit of that, the ceiling on compassion. Okay, that's number one. Number two, by the way, every one of these 5 steps starts with the letter P. Okay, so we had the pity experience with its limits, with its benefits and limits. Second, the world as is very often the case for Armenians, is splits into different camps. And the Armenians almost always fall right in the middle of these various camps. So in this particular iteration, I'll give you a shorthand here. My son is named Ardashes. For those of you who know Armenian history, he was the first real Armenian king, and he established a king between the Romans and the Persians, and the symbol of his kingdom was two eagles looking out, precisely because you were always in between these two powerful forces, and you better watch out. They're out to crush you, right? So during this split, the Cold War split, there were Armenians who lived in Armenia, which was under the Soviets, and there were Armenians who lived in the West, sort of like the NATO side, the Warsaw Pact side, capitalism, communism, East-West, on that divide. And Armenians were exceptionally good at being loyal to their side. We were exceptionally good at that, right? There were Armenians in the Soviet world who were exceptional Soviets, and there were Armenians in the Western world who were exceptional, whatever, Western advocates. And I think that served a useful purpose. It's good sometimes to take sides. I work very often with Armenian Democrats and Republicans, and we welcome Armenian Democrats and Republicans. We want passionate Democrats and Republicans, and we don't really have any preference one way or the other, because ultimately the lesson of taking sides is, yes, okay, from time to time take sides tactically, but always strategically take your own side. Take your own side. Let your first loyalty be to the survival of the Coptic nation. Let our first loyalty be to the survival of the Armenian people. I'll tell you this, the great powers of the world, they'll take care of themselves. They will survive. They have the viability, they have the resources, they have the geopolitics to do very well. They don't necessarily need small little minority groups weighing in as if this was the existential struggle for our survival. So I'm going to say it's perfectly fine to look at the world, take sides tactically where you need to, but ultimately there needs to be a place, and this is my advice based on hard experience, right, for organizations, for communities like ours to gather in rooms like this and to ask a very narrow question: what will serve our survival? What will serve our survival? Not what does this great power want, or how do I endear myself to this interest, or how does, frankly, I'm going to get into this a little more. How does somebody else manage our issue? And I'm going to get into that, okay? I'm going to get into that. So number one, pity, take it where you can get it, but don't bank on it. Second, taking sides, tactically be smart. Understand how to work with all the different players, but take your own side. Take your own side. A third stage of our growth as a community, this is in the last 50 years, was to take our issue to the outside world. And for us, that started in the mid-'60s for a variety of reasons. And we started protesting, and we started getting on sort of the global radar screen. Talat Pasha, who massacred the Armenians, one of the great cruel villains of the world, he was an architect of the Armenian genocide. He said, I have solved the Armenian issue for 50 years. And in a sense, he was right. It took until 1965 for a traumatized nation to finally stand up and say, enough of this, right? Enough lighting a candle, enough saying a prayer, enough mourning in church. Let's take our issue to the world. And we did, in protests, right? And in a little baby carriage, I got taken to all the different protests, as did my brothers and sisters and a generation of Armenians. And that was good, because it got the attention of the world. The big players started saying, oh, okay, this is political capital. They're generating political capital. And the way they look at it, it's not the way we look at it. The way they look at it is like, oh, political capital. How can I use that capital for my advantage? That's the way the big powers think, right? So we got ourselves on the radar screen through protest, but we realized, just as there are limits to the two other things I mentioned, there are serious limits to protesting, because the people you're protesting know that you're there today and you're not there tomorrow, and they can afford to ignore you until the next milestone, the next atrocity, the next anniversary. So protesting was an important part of our evolution. We woke, young Armenians especially in the 60s and 70s, woke up the rest of the Armenian nation, and you need that. It's very much a youth-driven exercise. But it's always a small group within any group that wakes up the rest. And ultimately, I'm going to say, that's the biggest battle. If you win that battle of waking up your community, waking up people to your cause, then everything else is possible. If you're unable to do that, then it's just we're talking to ourselves. So I'm going to say the protest movement was good to we woke up our community. It took us from the 60s probably through the 80s to kind of get people into the idea that we have to assert our own interests here. And, but we realized that you can't get a whole lot done there, and we moved to our fourth P, right? Well, which is pressure. Pressure. I wrote some notes here. I just want to make sure I cover these points. By pressure, I mean the stuff that you do, the stuff that we do, which is getting involved in elections, getting involved in legislative affairs, getting involved in media, using all the various tools that none of us invented, right, but that are available to us as Americans. America is a country that creates tremendous opportunities for citizens. Most of our fellow citizens don't take advantage of these opportunities, and they're largely apathetic. You have vast, vast reaches of American society that is not involved in civic life, which means groups, even small groups, but highly motivated groups, can have an outsized influence. And I would argue that that our communities still have room for growth in that area. We still have a lot of room for growth. Getting involved in like lobbying, in advocacy, in civic life, running for office, things like that, very, very essential. But that takes organization, it takes effort, it takes sustained and persistent sacrifice, right? And that's folks in this room, we're the people who do that stuff. We learned along the way, and we've been doing this pressure stuff, lobbying stuff since, really in a serious sense, professional sense, since the early 1980s. And we've had some successes and failures. If I have anything to share with you, it's based on just endless mishaps and bruised and scarred activists over the years who've we've done our best, but certainly not always with great success. But we've learned something along the way. One of the things we learned is the need to do that fifth P, right? So we had the pity thing, partisanship, taking sides, but taking our side, protesting, but understanding the limits of protest, pressuring U.S. policymakers to do the right thing, and then finally participating in the fabric of American decision-making, right? It's one thing to knock on the door, right, and to have it be answered by somebody who's not Armenian, and then persuading them or somehow motivating them to be supportive. It's another thing for Armenians to be behind those doors, right, sitting in meetings that we're not at, in consultations, or having Coptic Americans at the State Department, or at the Washington Post, or in congressional offices. I will say to you that the Coptic community today, based on my understanding of when folks arrived, right, the immigration history, and also the devotion to achievement and education, that you're actually at a moment where you probably, very likely, I would bet heavily actually, that you have a bunch of very, very talented 20 to 30-year-olds, right, who are still at the point where they care deeply about their heritage, they feel connected, maybe not in exactly the way their parents and grandparents did, the cultural stuff may be a little bit different, but deep down the DNA is there, right, but who also, right, have the high-level caring, but also have the high-level capacity, right? My grandfather came, my two grandfathers immigrated to America, one as a shepherd, which does not lend itself to influence in America. There are very few influential shepherds in the United States. And the other did leather work, right? And eventually went to dry cleaning. Also, like, honorable work, but you're not going to get very powerful, pressing people's clothes. So, but I think today the Coptic world is rich in young people who are who both care about their identity and are able to do something about it in the American civic space. I don't know if that will be true 50 or 100 years from now, but I'm pretty sure it's true today. So if we put 50 cents of every dollar into advocacy as an organization, we put another 50 cents into our youth programs. And we bought ourselves a building. It was hard, really hard. We bought ourselves an 8-bedroom bed and breakfast in downtown DC, and we provide free housing for young Armenian college graduates who are coming to DC to find work. And for 3 months, we'll train them like relentlessly on everything from how to shake hands, to how to hold an interview, to how to write a resume, LinkedIn, cover letter, all the rest, just so they can get their first really low-level job in DC. So they can get their foot on the ladder and then move up. And then you do that for 1 year, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, and then you have the people in the positions that you want to have them. You become part of the system. So these are the 5 steps that we've taken. We were pitied for a long time, the starving Armenians. We took sides in great struggles, but ultimately learned to take our own side. We raised our voices in protest, but understood that protest is not sustainable and doesn't really get the job done for you. Don't ever take protests out of your toolbox, but don't let it be the only tool in your toolbox. We got into pressure, and we work relentlessly hard to try to use every lever that we have as voters. We tend to fall in the category, I think, along with the Coptic community, where numbers can't be our game, right? I think Saul Alinsky wrote, he's a political writer from decades ago, he wrote, if you have numbers, play numbers. If you don't have numbers, make noise. I think we tend to be a community that our strength is motivation, networking, passion. It's not large numbers, and that's just the way it is. That's our destiny, so that's the card we have to play. So pressure is kind of like we're in the mid part of that effort, and then the future is how do young Armenians get involved in the decision making, so that one day when we knock on the door of the Department of State, we get somebody opens the door and says, "Pare vara minch peses," right? That would be like a dream of mine. Let me touch on that's our history. Let me touch on a few themes that I think might be helpful. First, personal, and then political. At the personal level, I'm going to offer my uninformed insights into the Coptic psyche, okay? I'm going to say there are 3 pieces you need. The first piece is caring, right? Does a young Coptic American care about the fate of their nation? I'm going to say the answer is yes, by and large, not uniformly. I'm also going to say that I'll speak for the Armenians. The ANC can't take any credit for that, for the Armenians in our community who care about their heritage, right? And that's because it's a parent, a grandparent, an uncle, a Sunday school teacher, a priest, a coach. There's some set of people in that child's life that instilled that in their heart, or perhaps not instilled it, fanned the flame that existed in their heart and built a fire, right? That's a precondition, sine qua non, without which nothing, right? That has to be there. If someone sends their 18 or 20-year-old to us who was not raised Armenian, and with the expectation, Aram, go and give this guy an internship, help them do this, it's like, that will be tough. Because I can't, at 18 or 20 years old, make somebody care about something. It's very rare. It happens, but don't bank on it, right? So that's the thing. Do Coptic Americans care? I think yes. Second, do they understand what they might be able to do to help? In any arena, religious arena, economic arena, for me, it's the political arena. I would say yeah. Whatever it is that needs to be taught, whatever it is that needs to be understood, can readily be understood. A few hours of discussion, a conference such as this, can teach most people what they need to do to be influential. How might you get on the radar screen of a congressional office? How might you build relationships such that legislator advances legislation? How might you engage with the State Department in a way that's effective, right? These things are not beyond the reach of any of our communities. And again, I'm sure that you have a bunch of very sharp young people who would catch this stuff very quickly, or they've already learned it in school and through their own lives. So that's number 2. Do you understand what to do? Yes, the answer is yes, but by and large. The third is, do they believe that it makes a difference? Or do they believe even that it's worth doing? And that's where we often fail. I'm going to say that's where the Armenian community fails in most cases, right? We have something like 2 million Armenians in America. I don't know that more than 100,000 of them are deeply engaged in our work. Maybe during crises, it might move up to 250,000 or more, but it's always a minority that's going to have the faith that this is worth it. And it's hard to instill that faith. And I'll say part of it is our history. We celebrate the Battle of Avarayr, which was a battle the Armenians fought in the mid-5th century. We lost that battle, but it nonetheless was a type of moral victory. We celebrate the Battle of Sardarabad, which was in 1918. We celebrate battles that were fought in the 1990s. But for every battle where Armenians prevailed, or at least declared a moral victory, we spent many centuries as subjects of other empires. And the habits that develop when you're a subject of another empire is keep your head down, don't rock the boat. If you want to survive, you won't make trouble, right? Perfectly fair, right? If I was a parent in 13th century Ottoman Empire, I would tell my kids to keep their head down because I love my kids, right? That's not true today, and it's not true here. This is a system that does not punish activism. In fact, if you want, as I say, the squeaky wheel gets the oil. This is a system in which being vocal is rewarded, being aggressive even. I think the last 8 years in American life has shown that there's no points for being the quiet, polite child in the classroom. There's nothing. They're not getting anywhere for that, right? So how do you do that? I tend to think that it's a small group of people, like those in this room, who through hand-holding and through role modeling and being an example, walk people through the process of it, because people aren't going to learn because you say, oh, do this because it's important. Take them by the hand and take them to a congressional meeting and say, you're going to sit in the corner here, and you're just going to listen. And maybe they'll do that 2 or 3 meetings. And at the next meeting, they'll take notes. And the next meeting, you'll give them a point to raise. And probably 1 or 2 meetings from then, they'll be leading the meeting. And now you have somebody who has come through experience to believe that they can make a difference. They'll see the results of their efforts, and they'll see it makes a difference. That is absolutely essential. So that's at the personal level. You already have people who care. You got super bright people. Just help instill that hope, that faith, that belief that they can make a difference. That's the personal side. The political side, and I'll try not to go too much longer, is, and I'll be very cynical here for you and the camera here. Forgive me. Ownership of issues in Washington is absolutely essential. I will say it this way. There's no issue in this city that has any political capital whatsoever that isn't owned by somebody. So if a constituency, right, has an issue, pick your issue, pick your community, but they don't take ownership of their issue, right? It's not as though that issue is then just floating around and is, kind of like an orphan. That will be owned by somebody. Somebody will own the issue. And I feel unentitled to offer too much advice on this subject because I'm not that well informed. But I can tell you that the fact, I'll speak about Turkey and Egypt, right? The fact that there's a major US relationship with Turkey, major, a NATO, trade, defense, it's like there's a multi-tiered, multi-arrayed relationship with Turkey. And for many years, right, our issue was, from the US government perspective, and the Russians and the Europeans all have their games, but from the US perspective, they would see it like, oh, the Armenians have raised their voice in the civic arena. They're doing their protests. They're doing their pressure. They've developed political capital. How can we utilize their political capital to advance our interests, right? And this is like, not, again, to be cynical about it, if you read the declassified record, if you read what the State Department declassifies after many decades, you can see that the Armenian genocide issue, for example, which was a righteous issue, one which ultimately we prevailed on, right? But it was used, we did it because we believed it was the right thing, and that would make Armenia safer if people recognized that we were the victims of genocide, that this should not happen again. But from a US government perspective, it's like, oh, let me go talk to the Turks and say, hey, the Friends of Armenia have this resolution in Congress. We'd like to oppose it, right? But it sure would make it a lot easier if you agree to this base agreement, or if you agree to this military purchase, or if you did something that supports, let's say, what the State Department or Defense Department wants from Turkey, right? So the point I'm trying to make is here that if you have political capital, and the Coptic community does have political capital, right? You just have to be on guard relentlessly such that it's your political capital. Nobody has the right to own our issues. They really don't. Because the people who would claim to own our issues are American citizens, but so are we. But so are we. And guess what? Who has more right to define what serves Coptic Americans, Americans of Coptic heritage, right? Than Coptic Americans. So you have to be on guard against that very aggressively, very aggressively. I can say that, again, I'm speaking in ignorance here, that the overarching landscape within which Coptic issues are addressed is primarily the U.S.-Egypt relationship. And maybe you would even argue the U.S.-Egypt-Israel relationship. There's some regional architecture there, and the Coptic issue is an issue within that context, but the question is, whose interests is that issue being managed? In whose interest is that issue being managed? And that's a wrestling match, and you have to fight for it every single day, right? Fight for it every single day. And there'll be folks who will say, this is what's good for you, or this is what's bad for you, or don't work with them, or work with them. No, take all the advice. Listen to all of your, whether they're friends or not friends, hear what they all have to say, but then again, gather in rooms like this and figure out what really is your interest. And then take that to the American table, the table of American democracy. This is what we expect. This is what we want. You'll lose a lot of the time. You'll take a beating a lot of the time. But ultimately, you earn the respect of the people who understand that you own your issue. You own your issue, nobody else. This is not something that, let me leave it at that. I'll start wrapping up here by saying our issues are not tools for others to manage, right? But rather capital that should serve our interests. I would say that given the history of the Coptic people, of Copts over the past centuries, that you all are very entitled to put that at the top of the agenda and say, like, that's going to be my North Star. That's going to be my North Star. And I know that others will have other views, but this has got to be ours. And that doesn't necessarily make you a lot of friends in this city, but it does earn your respect in a place like DC. I'll wrap up by talking about the 3 levels of engagement that we have, that we operate on. I think you guys operate on as well. The first is the geopolitics, like talking to America, the American decision makers, about geopolitics. That is a really tough game to play, right? Explaining why, I mean, there are geopolitical arguments, right? Here's why U.S. policy should be more sympathetic to the Armenians. Here's why U.S. policy should restrain or hold accountable those that attack Armenians. You can make the geopolitical argument, but you're talking to folks who are, if they're decision makers, they're 30 or 40 years into their professional career, and the chance of us being smart enough or good looking enough to convince people that their geopolitical orientation and all the habits they've developed over decades are wrong, it's like you have to go in, I think, with very realistic expectations, with your eyes open. So there should be constantly a geopolitical engagement with geopolitical thinkers in America, in the think tanks, in U.S. diplomacy, places like that. That's great. We should do it, but with very realistic expectations, number 1. Number 2, and there's just 3. Number 2 is civilizational. And I think that's a great strength of both of our communities, which is this is a peaceful, democratic, with democratic traditions, minority population at risk. They represent part of the rich diversity of the region. They're at risk of extinction or at the very least subjugation. And that at the level of civilizations, right, we're talking to the Americans now, right, at the level of civilizations, we are brothers and sisters and we should all act in solidarity. That's good, but again, go in with your eyes wide open. The Armenians are first, King Dertad declared Armenia a Christian nation in 301. We had the apostles Thaddeus and Bartholomew preach in Armenia, also die in Armenia. We have very much a Western tradition. We have deep roots through our diaspora, anchored in the West, very strong European orientation. All of that civilizational stuff added up to nothing in 2020 when Azerbaijan attacked, and then again in 2023 when they pushed out Armenians from part of yet more of our homeland, right? So you do the civilizational stuff, right? But you know it's a long game. It's, you make progress on that not in days or weeks, but in years and even decades. You have to engage in the civilizational thing, but understand there are serious limits to that. That's the second. The third, and I think this is the hardest, but the one that will bear the most fruit for us, is us as constituents, right? The geopolitics can be dismissed. The civilizational stuff, we can be given lip service, but then disregarded. The constituency capital that we have is unavoidable in American civic life, right? This system is responsive to voters. This system is responsive to political pressure. And the Coptic community is, my numbers are going to be off here, but I believe it's among the fastest growing Christian denominations in America since, let's say, the 1970s. I don't know how many parishes there are, over 200, I hope, over, in the U.S.
Around 1 million.
No, parishes, churches.
Churches, around 300.
Wow, I did not know that. My numbers are old, okay? So a community with 300 parishes, right, I'm sure spread across 200 districts, maybe 150 to 200 congressional districts, is a powerful constituency, right? And I would argue that, maintain the geopolitical engagement, always underscore, stress the civilizational affinity of Copts and Americans because of our faith, because of our democratic orientation, because of our tolerance, pluralism, all that stuff. But place your heaviest bets on organizing the constituency and being a voice that policymakers and politicians cannot afford to ignore. Thank you.